The champagne bubbles rose lazily through the crystal flute as I watched my husband David prepare for what he believed would be his moment of triumph. 22 years of marriage, and he thought tonight would be the night he finally broke me. The Riverside Country Club's private dining room sparkled with candlelight, filled with our closest friends, business associates, and family members who had gathered to celebrate our anniversary. David stood at the head of the mahogany table, his silk Armani tie catching the light as he adjusted it, a nervous habit I'd observed countless times during board meetings over the years. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. What David didn't know was that I had been waiting for this moment far longer than he had been planning it. While he thought he was orchestrating my humiliation, I had spent months preparing for what would become the most spectacular reversal in Chicago's business history. The irony wasn't lost on me that we were celebrating at the same club where my grandfather had first taught me about the art of strategic patience. "Sometimes, Rebecca," he had said, pointing across the dining room where deals worth millions were made over dessert and brandy, "the most powerful move is the one nobody sees coming. Let them think they know the game while you're playing by entirely different rules." Tonight, David would learn exactly what those words meant. I had chosen my outfit with the same precision a general selects battlefield positions. The midnight blue Oscar de la Renta dress wasn't just elegant, it was armor. Every piece of jewelry I wore told a story David had never bothered to learn. The sapphire earrings had belonged to my great-grandmother, who had built her first textile mill in 1923. The vintage Patek Philippe watch had been my grandfather's, worn on the day he signed the papers that would eventually give me control of what David believed was his empire. Most importantly, the simple platinum band on my right hand bore the seal of Hammond Holdings, the parent company that had remained invisible to David throughout our entire marriage. As I watched him scan the room with satisfaction, greeting guests who had no idea they were about to witness corporate history in the making, I reflected on how we had arrived at this moment. David Richardson had been everything a young woman from a powerful family was supposed to want: handsome, ambitious, charming at cocktail parties. When we met at Northwestern, he was already making waves in the business program, his professors predicting great things for the driven young man from Detroit. What had attracted me initially was his hunger. Unlike the other men in my social circle who had been handed everything, David genuinely wanted to build something. His eyes would light up when he talked about his vision for a consulting firm that would revolutionize how mid-sized companies approached growth strategies. I admired his passion, his willingness to work 18-hour days, his refusal to rely on family connections. The mistake I made was assuming that admiration would be mutual. Our wedding had been the social event of the season, featured in Chicago Magazine and attended by 3 governors, 2 senators, and half the Fortune 500. David had been so proud, telling everyone who would listen how he'd won the heart of Rebecca Hammond, heiress to one of the Midwest's most influential business families. What he never understood was that being an heiress was just the beginning of my story, not the entirety of it. From the age of 12, I had been groomed not just to inherit wealth, but to wield it. While my classmates at Sacred Heart Academy were learning French and etiquette, I was studying financial statements in my grandfather's study. While they were at Cotillion, I was sitting in on board meetings, learning to read the subtle dynamics of corporate power. My grandfather, Hammond Industries founder, had been preparing me for something far greater than being a wealthy man's wife. The family business needs an heir who understands that power without purpose is just expensive entertainment, he had told me during one of our evening walks through Lincoln Park. Your generation will face challenges that require more than just writing checks to charity. You'll need to know how to actually run things. The training had been intensive and largely invisible. Summers that my friends spent in the Hamptons, I spent learning operations management at our textile plants. Spring breaks others used for skiing in Aspen, I used it for understanding international markets at our facilities in Mexico and Malaysia. By the time I graduated from Wharton with my MBA, I knew more about running Hammond Industries than anyone except my grandfather himself. David had supported my education, proud to have a wife with business credentials, but he never quite grasped the scope of what I was learning. When I discussed strategic planning concepts or mentioned insights from my management courses, He'd smile indulgently and change the subject to his own projects. It became clear that he viewed my business education as an expensive hobby, something that made me a more interesting dinner party companion, but not a serious factor in real corporate decision-making. The first crack in our marriage hadn't been another woman. It had been his assumption that my role would always be secondary to his ambitions. When David finally launched Richardson Consulting 3 years after our wedding, he'd been so focused on proving himself that he never noticed the unusual terms of his startup funding. The initial capital had come through what appeared to be a venture fund, specializing in emerging consulting firms. David had been thrilled by their confidence in his vision, never questioning why established investors would take such an interest in an unproven 26-year-old. The truth was simpler than he could have imagined. Hammond Holdings had provided the funding through a carefully structured subsidiary, ensuring that David's dream could become reality, while maintaining strategic oversight of his operations. My grandfather had insisted on this arrangement, believing that supporting David's ambitions would keep him satisfied, while allowing the family to monitor his activities. "Let him build his little empire," my grandfather had said with a slight smile. "Young men need to feel important. Just make sure we maintain ultimate control." For the first 5 years, the arrangement worked perfectly. David's firm grew steadily, attracting mid-level clients and building a reputation for thorough analysis and practical solutions. He was proud of his independence, often telling people at parties how he'd built his business without relying on his wife's family connections. I played my part beautifully, the supportive spouse who attended client dinners and ribbon cuttings, offering just enough business insight to be helpful without overshadowing his authority. The problems began when David's success started going to his head. As Richardson Consulting landed bigger contracts and higher-profile clients, David began viewing himself as Chicago's rising business star. Magazine profiles followed, speaking engagements at industry conferences, invitations to join prestigious boards. The media loved the narrative of the self-made entrepreneur who had married into old money but carved his own path to success. What the media didn't know was that many of David's most impressive contracts had been quietly facilitated by Hammond Holdings' extensive network. When Richardson Consulting landed the massive restructuring project for Midwest Manufacturing, it was because my family's investment firm held a significant stake in the company. When they were selected to advise Great Lakes Shipping on their expansion strategy, it was because Hammond Industries had been doing business with Great Lakes for 3 decades. David never asked how these opportunities found their way to his relatively small firm. His ego preferred the explanation that his reputation was simply growing too impressive to ignore. The transformation in his personality became more noticeable around year 7 of our marriage. The driven young man who had worked late into the night strategizing about client needs began spending more time managing his public image than focusing on actual business development. He hired a publicist, started accepting speaking fees, and began treating Richardson Consulting less like a service business and more like a platform for his personal brand. That was when Angela Martinez entered our lives. And David had hired Angela as his executive assistant after his previous secretary retired. At 28, she was young, ambitious, and possessed the kind of sharp intelligence that made her genuinely valuable in a fast-paced consulting environment. Unlike the administrative assistants David had employed before, Angela actively participated in strategic discussions, offered insights on client presentations, and quickly became what David described as indispensable to operations. I had no initial concerns about Angela. She was professional, efficient, and clearly talented at her job. When I'd visit David's office for the occasional lunch meeting or client event, she was always courteous and knowledgeable about the business. If anything, I was pleased that David had finally found someone who could keep pace with his increasingly complex schedule. I had no initial concerns about Angela. She was professional, efficient, and clearly talented at her job. When I'd visit David's office for the occasional lunch meeting or client event, she was always courteous and knowledgeable about the business. If anything, I was pleased that David had finally found someone who could keep pace with his increasingly complex schedule. The first sign that something had shifted came during a client dinner at Gibson's Steakhouse about 18 months after Angela joined the firm. David was presenting a market analysis to the board of a regional bank, and Angela had accompanied us to provide additional data support. Throughout the meal, I noticed the subtle ways they communicated, quick glances when discussing strategy, inside jokes about client quirks, a familiarity that went beyond typical professional boundaries. What struck me most was how David included Angela in conversations that he typically kept separate from what he considered, quote, family time. When the bank's president asked about market trends in the Southeast, David turned to Angela for confirmation of data points that he certainly knew himself. When discussion turned to implementation timelines, he deferred to her expertise on scheduling and resource allocation. It wasn't romantic yet, I was certain of that. But it was something else, something that made me pay closer attention to the dynamics at Richardson Consulting. Over the following months, I began noticing changes in David's routine that individually seemed insignificant, but collectively painted a concerning picture. He was staying later at the office more frequently, often calling at 7 or 8 in the evening to say that he and Angela were finishing up the Peterson proposal or reviewing tomorrow's presentation materials. Weekend work sessions became more common, always with Angela present to handle what David described as urgent client needs. When I'd suggest joining them for these weekend sessions, after all, I did hold an MBA and had significant business experience, David would decline, saying the work was too detail-oriented or that they needed to focus without distractions. The dismissal stung, but I told myself it was just David's professional pride, his need to maintain clear boundaries between his business success and his family connections. The turning point came during Richardson Consulting's 10th anniversary celebration. David had organized an elegant reception at the Palmer House, inviting clients, vendors, and industry contacts to celebrate the firm's growth and success. As I watched him work the room that evening, I realized that Angela had become far more than an assistant. She was functioning as his unofficial partner in every meaningful way. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. She knew the personal details of every major client, understood the firm's strategic positioning better than most of the senior consultants, and moved through the crowd with the confidence of someone who considered herself a key stakeholder in the business. When longtime clients asked about recent projects, they often directed their questions to Angela rather than the other consultants present. When potential new clients wanted to understand Richardson Consulting's approach, David would bring Angela into the conversation to explain their methodology. Most telling was how David introduced her throughout the evening. Not as my assistant Angela or even Angela from our team, but simply as Angela, with the assumption that everyone should already know who she was and why her opinions mattered. That night, as we drove home through the quiet streets of Lincoln Park, I asked David directly about Angela's expanding role in the firm. His response was both revealing and infuriating. Angela understands the business in ways that most people don't, he said, keeping his eyes on the road. She's not just handling administrative tasks anymore. She's become essential to our strategic planning. I'm thinking about promoting her to Director of Operations. The casualness of his tone bothered me more than the promotion itself. David was discussing a major organizational change that would significantly increase Angela's authority and compensation, yet this was the first I was hearing about it. More importantly, he was describing someone who had become central to his professional life without ever considering how that might affect our personal relationship. That's quite a jump from executive assistant, I observed, testing his reaction. What kind of experience does she have with operations management? David's jaw tightened slightly, a sign that he was feeling defensive. Experience isn't everything, Rebecca. Some people have natural business instincts that can't be taught in a classroom. Angela understands our clients, she knows how to manage complex projects, and she's completely committed to the firm's success. The implication was clear. Unlike his wife, whose business education was merely academic, Angela possessed real-world business sense that David valued more than formal credentials. It was a subtle dig that revealed how David had come to view our respective contributions to his success. Over the following year, as Angela's influence within Richardson Consulting continued to grow, I began conducting my own quiet investigation into the firm's operations. What I discovered was both impressive and deeply troubling. On the impressive side, Angela had genuinely transformed how the firm operated. She had streamlined client communication systems, implemented project management protocols that improved efficiency, and developed relationships with key vendors that reduced operational costs. Her strategic insights were often sharp and well-reasoned, and several major client retentions could be directly attributed to her interventions. The troubling aspect was how completely David had come to rely on her judgment, often above that of his senior consultants or outside advisors. Major business decisions that should have involved careful analysis and multiple perspectives were increasingly being made based on Angela's recommendations. David's confidence in her abilities had grown to the point where he seemed to view her insights as infallible. More concerning was how their working relationship had begun affecting David's behavior at home. Conversations about business that had once been collaborative became one-sided updates about decisions that had already been made. When I'd offer perspectives on industry trends or strategic considerations, David would often respond with, "Angela and I already discussed that," or "Angela's research suggests something different." The message was unmistakable. My input was no longer valued or needed because David had found someone whose business judgment he trusted more completely. The final piece of evidence came when I discovered that David had authorized Angela to represent Richardson Consulting at a major industry conference in Denver, essentially functioning as the firm's public face for a high-profile networking event. When I asked about this decision, David explained that Angela's deep knowledge of their client portfolio made her the logical choice to discuss the firm's capabilities with potential new business contacts. The explanation might have been reasonable if it weren't for one crucial detail. Angela would be presenting Richardson Consulting's methodology and case studies to an audience that included several Hammond Holdings subsidiary companies. David was essentially sending his assistant to pitch services to my family's business interests, without ever considering whether I might have insights into those companies' actual needs and decision-making processes. That was when I realized David's feelings for Angela had progressed far beyond professional admiration. He was so focused on impressing her with his business acumen that he'd lost sight of the larger strategic picture, including the reality that his supposedly independent firm had always been operating within my family's sphere of influence. As I sat in our Lincoln Park townhouse that evening, watching David prepare presentation notes for Angela's Denver trip, I understood that our marriage had reached a crossroads. David was clearly moving toward a future that didn't include me as a meaningful partner, either personally or professionally. The question was whether I would let him dictate the terms of that transition or take control of the narrative myself. That night, I made two important phone calls. The first was to my grandfather's former attorney, who still handled certain delicate matters for Hammond Holdings. The second was to the private investigation firm that had discreetly managed background checks for our family's business interests for over 2 decades. It was time to understand exactly what David and Angela were planning, and, more importantly, to prepare for the moment when their plans would collide with reality. The investigation revealed what I had already suspected but needed to confirm with documentation. David and Angela's relationship had evolved beyond professional collaboration into something far more personal. Hotel receipts from business trips showed adjoining rooms that suggested intimate access. Credit card statements revealed personal dinners charged to business accounts, weekend trips disguised as client meetings, and jewelry purchases that David certainly hadn't given to his wife. More significantly, the investigation uncovered evidence that Angela had been researching options for starting her own consulting firm, with David as a potential partner. Email exchanges between them discussed client lists, competitive strategies, and financial projections for a new venture that would directly compete with Richardson Consulting's current operations. David wasn't just having an affair. He was planning to abandon the firm that my family had quietly supported for over a decade, taking key clients and institutional knowledge to launch a new venture with his mistress. The betrayal was complete, both personal and professional. But as I reviewed the evidence in my grandfather's old study, surrounded by portraits of Hammond family leaders who had built and protected our business empire for 4 generations, I felt something that surprised me: gratitude. David had finally given me the justification I needed to stop playing the supportive wife and start being the business leader I had been trained to become. The private investigation firm I hired, Blackstone Security, specialized in corporate intelligence and had worked with Hammond Holdings for 23 years. Their founder, Thomas Crawford, had personally handled sensitive matters for my grandfather, including the delicate background checks that preceded major acquisitions, and the discreet monitoring that sometimes revealed industrial espionage attempts. When I met with Crawford at his downtown office 3 weeks after David's Denver conference decision, I was careful to frame my request in business terms. I need a comprehensive analysis of Richardson Consulting's operational integrity, I explained, sliding a formal contract across his mahogany desk. There are concerns about potential conflicts of interest and misuse of company resources that could affect Hammond Holdings' strategic interests. Crawford, a man in his late 50s with silver hair and eyes that had seen too many corporate secrets, nodded without surprise. Standard executive oversight audit, he confirmed, scanning the paperwork. Financial records, communication patterns, travel documentation, professional associations. How deep do you want us to go? Deep enough to understand whether Richardson Consulting can be trusted with the level of business we're considering directing their way, I replied, which was technically true. Hammond Holdings had been considering whether to formalize their relationship with David's firm by offering a major consulting contract for our international expansion project. What I didn't mention was that my real interest lay in understanding exactly how far David and Angela's relationship had progressed, and more importantly, what their future plans might mean for both my marriage and my family's business interests. The investigation began immediately, with Crawford's team employing the same sophisticated techniques they used for corporate due diligence. Within 48 hours, they had accessed financial records, travel patterns, and communication metadata that painted a picture far more complex than simple infidelity. The first report arrived by secure courier on a Thursday evening while David was attending what he claimed was a client dinner with a potential new account. As I reviewed the preliminary findings in my grandfather's study, the scope of David and Angela's deception became clear. Their relationship had begun 18 months earlier, shortly after the 10th anniversary celebration where I had first noticed their unusual dynamic. The progression had been gradual but systematic, moving from extended working dinners to weekend strategy sessions, then to overnight trips that coincided with industry conferences. Hotel records showed they had shared accommodations in Atlanta, Minneapolis, and Phoenix, always booking adjoining suites that provided the appearance of propriety while enabling private access. More disturbing was the financial analysis. Angela's personal expenses had increased dramatically over the past year, including purchases that far exceeded her official salary. A detailed audit of Richardson Consulting's accounts revealed a pattern of questionable charges. Expensive dinners classified as client entertainment, but attended only by David and Angela, spa weekend packages listed as corporate retreat expenses, and jewelry purchases from Tiffany & Company that had been written off as client gifts but never delivered to any documented recipients. David had been funding Angela's lifestyle through creative expense management, essentially using company resources to support his mistress, while maintaining the fiction that their relationship was purely professional. The second phase of Crawford's investigation focused on their communications, both digital and traditional. What his team discovered exceeded even my expectations for thoroughness. David and Angela had been remarkably careless about operational security, apparently believing that their positions within the firm provided sufficient cover for their activities. Email exchanges revealed not just personal intimacy, but extensive discussions about business strategy that went far beyond Angela's official role as executive assistant. She had been providing input on major client decisions, recommending pricing strategies for new contracts, and even suggesting personnel changes that would consolidate her influence within the firm. More significantly, the communications revealed that Angela had been researching the possibility of starting her own consulting firm, with David as a potential partner. Draft business plans found on her personal laptop outlined a venture called Martinez & Associates, which would specialize in exactly the same mid-market corporate consulting that Richardson Consulting provided. The business plan was sophisticated and detailed, including financial projections, marketing strategies, and a client acquisition timeline that relied heavily on relationships David had built through Richardson Consulting. Most damaging was a section titled Strategic Advantages, which explicitly described how David's industry connections and existing client relationships would provide immediate credibility for the new firm. They weren't just having an affair, they were planning to steal David's entire business model and client base to launch a competing venture. The third report arrived as I was preparing for a charity luncheon at the University Club, where I served on the board alongside several other prominent Chicago businesswives. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was about to spend the afternoon discussing fundraising strategies with women who viewed me primarily as David Richardson's supportive spouse, while in my briefcase lay evidence that would completely reframe our family's position in Chicago's business community. This report focused on Angela's background and qualifications, which proved to be even more interesting than her current activities. Crawford's team had discovered that Angela Martinez was far more ambitious and qualified than David realized. She held an MBA from DePaul University, which she had completed through evening classes while working full-time. Her academic record was exceptional, with particular strength in strategic planning and operations management. More revealing was her employment history prior to joining Richardson Consulting. Angela had worked for 3 different consulting firms over the previous 8 years, and in each case, she had left under circumstances that suggested conflicts with senior management. References from former colleagues painted a picture of someone who was highly capable but prone to overstepping professional boundaries when she believed her expertise wasn't being properly recognized. At her previous firm, Morrison Strategic, Angela had been terminated after 6 months for, quote, insubordination and failure to respect organizational hierarchy. According to confidential interviews Crawford's team conducted with former Morrison employees, Angela had repeatedly challenged the managing partner's decisions in client meetings and had begun communicating directly with major clients without authorization. The pattern was clear. Angela Martinez was not content to remain in supporting roles, regardless of her official job title. She possessed genuine business skills and strategic thinking abilities, but she lacked the patience or political acumen to advance through traditional corporate structures. David had provided her with exactly what she needed: access to clients, decision-making authority, and a partner who valued her input over that of more experienced professionals. What David didn't understand was that Angela viewed him not as a romantic partner but as a stepping stone to her own business empire. The communications Crawford's team had intercepted included several exchanges with headhunters and business brokers, indicating that Angela was exploring multiple options for advancing her career, with or without David's involvement. The most damaging evidence came in the 4th report, which detailed their recent activities surrounding what David had described to me as, quote, preliminary discussions with potential investors. In reality, David and Angela had been actively pitching Martinez and Associates to several venture capital firms, using financial projections and client testimonials that belonged to Richardson Consulting. They had presented themselves as the quote, founding partners of a new venture that would improve upon traditional consulting models by offering more personalized service and innovative strategic approaches. The presentations included case studies from Richardson Consulting's most successful projects, with David and Angela positioned as the primary architects of those successes. Most egregiously, they had been using Richardson Consulting's conference room and administrative resources to conduct these meetings, essentially employing my family's investment to help them steal David's own business. The audacity was breathtaking, but it also provided exactly the ammunition I needed for what was coming next. As I reviewed the complete investigation file in my grandfather's study, I realized that David and Angela had made a crucial strategic error. They had been so focused on building their case for independence that they had documented their theft in exhaustive detail. Every email, every financial transaction, every client contact had been preserved in corporate systems that Hammond Holdings technically controlled. They had built their own prosecution case without realizing it. Evers Tekentokshin. The final element I needed was timing. Crawford's surveillance team had been monitoring David and Angela's schedule for 3 weeks, and they had identified a pattern that would serve my purposes perfectly. David had been telling me that he was working late several evenings each week to prepare for what he called year-end strategic planning. In reality, these evening sessions were when he and Angela conducted their most sensitive planning for Martinez and Associates, using Richardson Consulting's offices after other employees had departed. More importantly, Crawford's team had intercepted communications indicating that David and Angela were planning to make their relationship public soon, possibly as early as our upcoming anniversary dinner. Angela had been researching wedding venues and had even visited several high-end event planners, describing herself as recently engaged to a successful businessman. They were planning to use our anniversary celebration as the stage for announcing their engagement, believing that the public setting would prevent me from creating a scene, and that the presence of our friends and business associates would force me to accept their relationship gracefully. David had calculated that presenting me with a fait accompli in front of witnesses would minimize any resistance I might offer and would allow them to control the narrative about their love story overcoming traditional marriage constraints. Angela had apparently convinced him that modern women understood when relationships evolved beyond their original boundaries, and that I would ultimately appreciate his honesty. They had fundamentally misunderstood who they were dealing with. The investigation had also revealed the extent to which David had been sharing confidential information about Hammond Holdings with Angela. During their evening planning sessions, he had apparently provided her with detailed briefings about my family's business interests, including information about upcoming acquisitions, strategic partnerships, and competitive advantages that she had no legitimate reason to access. Angela had been taking notes during these discussions, building her own database of intelligence about Chicago's business landscape that she could eventually use to benefit Martinez and Associates. She understood that knowledge about Hammond Holdings' activities would provide significant competitive advantages for any consulting firm seeking to serve mid-market companies in the Midwest. David's pillow talk had become corporate espionage, and neither of them seemed to understand the legal implications of what they were doing. As I prepared my response strategy, I realized that David and Angela had provided me with something invaluable: moral clarity. For months, I had struggled with questions about whether to confront David directly, attempt marriage counseling, or simply accept that our relationship had run its course. Their investigation findings eliminated any ambiguity about their intentions or their respect for our marriage. They weren't seeking divorce or separation. They were planning theft, both personal and professional. David intended to abandon our marriage and steal the business that my family had quietly supported, while Angela planned to leverage insider information about Hammond Holdings to benefit their new venture. The betrayal was complete and undeniable, which meant my response could be equally comprehensive. I spent the following weekend at my family's estate in Lake Forest, ostensibly helping my grandmother organize her papers, but actually using the time to develop my strategy in complete privacy. The estate's library, where my grandfather had conducted his most sensitive business discussions, provided the perfect environment for planning what would become the most important business negotiation of my life. The plan I developed was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than confronting David and Angela directly about their affair, I would allow them to proceed with their anniversary announcement exactly as they had planned. The public setting they had chosen to protect themselves would instead become the stage for revealing the true ownership structure of Richardson Consulting and the legal implications of their attempt to steal company assets. David wanted to use our anniversary to announce his new relationship. I would use the same event to announce my ownership of his firm and the criminal charges that would follow any attempt to misappropriate company resources or confidential information. The key was timing. I needed to let David and Angela believe they were controlling events, right up until the moment when they discovered that they had never understood the game they were playing. My grandfather had always taught me that the most devastating business moves were those that appeared to give opponents exactly what they wanted, right up until they realized they had been maneuvered into an impossible position. David and Angela wanted a public forum to legitimize their relationship and their business plans. I would give them exactly that forum, along with an audience that would witness their complete destruction. The preparation required coordination between Hammond Holdings' legal team, Crawford's investigation firm, and the restaurant management at Riverside Country Club. Every detail needed to be perfect, because I would only have one opportunity to execute this strategy. As I finalized the arrangements from my grandfather's desk, looking out over the grounds where 4 generations of Hammond family leaders had planned their most important business strategies, I felt the weight of tradition settling around me like armor. David had made the mistake of believing that 22 years of marriage had taught him everything he needed to know about his wife. Tomorrow night, he would discover that he had never really known me at all. The week before our anniversary dinner unfolded like a carefully choreographed performance, with each day bringing me closer to the moment when 22 years of careful planning would culminate in David's complete professional destruction. While he and Angela believed they were orchestrating my humiliation, I was putting the finishing touches on what would become Chicago's most talked-about corporate takedown. Monday morning began with a call from Harrison Beck, Hammond Holdings' chief legal counsel and my grandfather's former protege. Harrison had been managing the company's most sensitive legal matters for 15 years, and his discretion was absolute. When I requested a meeting at his LaSalle Street offices rather than our usual conference calls, he understood immediately that the situation required his personal attention. Rebecca, Harrison said, rising from behind his mahogany desk as I entered his corner office overlooking the Chicago River. Thomas Crawford briefed me on the preliminary findings. I've reviewed the evidence, and I must say, David has created quite a comprehensive case against himself. I settled into the leather chair across from his desk, appreciating Harrison's ability to cut directly to the heart of any matter. At 62, he possessed the kind of legal mind that could navigate the most complex corporate structures while maintaining perfect composure under pressure. My grandfather had chosen him specifically because he understood that real power often required actions that couldn't be discussed in polite society. The financial irregularities alone would justify immediate termination, Harrison continued, opening a thick folder that contained Crawford's complete investigation report. But the industrial espionage aspects make this a potential criminal matter. David has been sharing proprietary information about Hammond Holdings with someone who has no security clearance or legitimate business need for that intelligence. I had anticipated this conversation, but hearing Harrison confirm the legal implications in his measured tone made the reality more concrete. David wasn't just betraying our marriage. He was committing crimes that could result in federal prosecution. What are our options? I asked, though I already knew Harrison would have prepared a comprehensive strategy. Several approaches, he replied, sliding another document across the desk. We could pursue immediate civil litigation for breach of fiduciary duty, misappropriation of corporate assets, and violation of confidentiality agreements. The criminal aspects could be referred to federal prosecutors who specialize in corporate espionage cases. He paused, studying my expression carefully. However, given the personal dimensions of this situation, you might prefer more dramatic resolution that addresses both the business and personal betrayals simultaneously. Harrison had known me since I was 12 years old, sitting in on board meetings and learning to read between the lines of corporate communications. He understood that my grandfather had trained me to think strategically about both immediate objectives and long-term positioning. A quiet legal settlement might protect Hammond Holdings' interests, but it wouldn't serve the larger purpose of establishing my authority within Chicago's business community. Tell me about the dramatic option, I said, settling back in my chair. Harrison's smile was barely perceptible, but I caught the glint of anticipation in his eyes. We allow David and Angela to proceed with their anniversary announcement exactly as planned. You attend the dinner, play the supportive wife until they reveal their engagement, then respond by announcing your ownership of Richardson Consulting and the immediate termination of both their employment contracts. The elegance of the approach was immediately apparent. David and Angela would trap themselves in front of witnesses, making public declarations about their relationship and their business plans, just moments before learning that they had no authority to make either announcement. The legal documentation is already prepared, Harrison continued, producing a leather portfolio. Termination papers citing cause, non-compete agreements that prevent them from soliciting Richardson Consulting's clients, and forfeiture clauses that reclaim any company property or resources they've misappropriated. I reviewed the papers with admiration for Harrison's thoroughness. Every detail had been considered, from the specific legal language that would withstand any challenge to the timing requirements that would make the terminations effective immediately upon signature. There's one additional element, Harrison said, his tone becoming even more serious. Given the extent of David's financial irregularities, we're recommending that Hammond Holdings file a formal complaint with the Illinois Attorney General's office regarding potential fraud and embezzlement. The criminal investigation would begin the day after your anniversary dinner. The implications were staggering. David wouldn't just lose his job and his business. He would face criminal prosecution that could result in prison time. Angela's career would be destroyed before it had really begun, and their romantic relationship would be tested by legal pressures that neither of them was prepared to handle. How long have you been preparing for this possibility? I asked, genuinely curious about Harrison's level of advanced planning. Since the day David signed his original employment contract, Harrison replied without hesitation. Your grandfather insisted that we include provisions for exactly this type of situation. He believed that any man who married into the Hammond family for the wrong reasons would eventually reveal his true character through his professional choices. My grandfather's foresight was remarkable, but not surprising. He had built Hammond Holdings by anticipating every possible threat to the family's interests, including the possibility that a son-in-law might eventually become a liability rather than an asset. Tuesday brought meetings with the key players who would need to be coordinated for Saturday's revelation. The first was Patricia Williams, the general manager of Riverside Country Club, who had been managing high-profile events for Chicago's elite families for over 20 years. Patricia understood discretion, and she had witnessed enough dramatic moments at the club to appreciate the importance of proper staging. "Mrs. Richardson," Patricia said as we met in her office overlooking the club's main dining room, "I understand you have some special requirements for Saturday's anniversary celebration." Special was an understatement. I needed Patricia to coordinate several elements that would ensure maximum impact for my announcement, while maintaining the appearance of a normal anniversary dinner until the crucial moment. "The seating arrangements are critical," I explained, producing a detailed chart that Harrison's team had prepared. "David and Angela need to be positioned so that every guest has a clear view of their reactions when certain information is revealed." Patricia studied the seating chart with professional interest. She had organized countless corporate events where business deals were made or broken over dinner, and she understood the strategic importance of room dynamics. "We'll also need discrete recording capabilities," I continued, noting Patricia's slight nod of understanding. "Nothing invasive, but sufficient documentation to support any legal proceedings that might follow." "The club's standard event photography can be expanded to include video coverage," Patricia replied smoothly. "For historical documentation purposes, of course. The recording would serve multiple functions. It would provide evidence of David and Angela's public announcements about their relationship and business plans, while also documenting their reactions to learning about their immediate termination. More importantly, it would ensure that Chicago's business community had access to footage that would make denying the events impossible." Wednesday was devoted to coordinating with Richardson Consulting's other employees, most of whom had no idea about David and Angela's relationship or their plans to steal company resources. This required delicate handling, since I needed to ensure their cooperation without revealing the full scope of what was planned for Saturday. I scheduled individual meetings with the firm's 3 senior consultants: Michael Chen, who had been with the company for 8 years, Sarah Patterson, a strategic planning specialist who joined 4 years ago, and James Morrison, the firm's financial analyst who had recently discovered some of the irregularities in the company's expense accounts. Each meeting followed the same pattern. I explained that Hammond Holdings was considering a formal partnership with Richardson Consulting that would require enhanced oversight of the firm's operations. This partnership would potentially involve significant new contracts and expanded responsibilities for qualified employees, but it would also require absolute transparency about any existing operational issues. Michael Chen was the most receptive to this news, having long suspected that Richardson Consulting's success was somehow connected to my family's business network. "Mrs. Richardson," he said during our coffee meeting at a neutral location downtown, "I've always wondered how we consistently landed contracts with companies that seemed beyond our typical reach. It makes sense that there were family connections facilitating those opportunities." Michael's honesty was refreshing, and it confirmed that David's ego had prevented him from sharing credit for the firm's success, even with his senior employees. Michael had been attributing the firm's growth to his own hard work and David's leadership, never realizing that many of their biggest wins had been quietly arranged through Hammond Holdings' influence. Sarah Patterson's reaction was more complex. As someone who specialized in strategic planning, she had noticed patterns in Richardson Consulting's client acquisition that didn't align with typical business development practices. "The timing of certain contracts always seemed unusually convenient," she admitted. "And some of our clients had requirements that perfectly matched our capabilities, almost as if the opportunities were specifically designed for our firm." Sarah's analytical mind had identified the invisible hand that had been guiding Richardson Consulting's growth, but she had assumed it was simply David's exceptional networking abilities rather than systemic family intervention. James Morrison provided the most valuable perspective since his financial analysis had already uncovered evidence of David and Angela's inappropriate expense management. "I've been documenting irregularities for several months," he admitted, producing a folder thick with receipts and bank statements. "But I wasn't sure how to address the issue. given that the expenses were being approved by David personally. James had essentially completed an internal audit that perfectly complemented Crawford's investigation, providing additional evidence of David and Angela's systematic theft of company resources. His documentation would be crucial for any criminal prosecution that followed Saturday's revelations. Thursday involved the most delicate coordination of all, ensuring that the right people would be present at Saturday's dinner to witness David and Angela's public humiliation. The guest list needed to include individuals who could immediately understand the business implications of what they were seeing, while also representing the social circles that would spread the story throughout Chicago's elite community. I personally called each invitee, ostensibly to confirm their attendance at what I described as a special anniversary celebration that David and I have been planning for months. The language was technically accurate, since David had indeed been planning his announcement for months, though he had no idea what my plans included. The guest list read like a directory of Chicago's business establishment, venture capital partners who might have funded Martinez and Associates, corporate lawyers who represented Richardson Consulting's competitors, social leaders whose opinions shaped the city's elite circles, and business journalists who could ensure that Saturday's events received appropriate media coverage. Each confirmation call reinforced my reputation as the gracious hostess who organized Chicago's most sophisticated social events. None of the invitees suspected that they were being assembled to witness the systematic destruction of two people's personal and professional lives. Friday brought the final preparations, including a detailed briefing with Crawford's security team about their role in Saturday's events. While the investigation phase was complete, Crawford's people would provide discreet monitoring to ensure that David and Angela couldn't escape or destroy evidence once they realized what was happening. Two teams, Crawford explained as we met in his office for the final time. Surveillance outside the club to monitor any attempt to leave early, and technical support inside to ensure that all communications are recorded, and any electronic devices are secured if necessary. The level of preparation might have seemed excessive for what was essentially a dinner party, but Crawford understood that David and Angela would likely panic once they grasped the scope of their exposure. People who had been stealing company resources and planning industrial espionage weren't likely to react calmly when confronted with evidence of their crimes. One more thing, Crawford added as I prepared to leave. Angela has been unusually active today, making multiple calls to business contacts and visiting her bank. She may be preparing to accelerate their timeline if she suspects something. This information was concerning but not unexpected. Angela's survival instincts were sharp, and she might have detected subtle changes in office dynamics as Richardson Consulting's employees began anticipating the Hammond Holdings partnership announcement. However, any acceleration of their plans would only make Saturday's revelations more dramatic. If Angela pushed David to make their engagement announcement even more prominently, it would amplify the contrast when they learned about their immediate termination. Friday evening, I spent alone in my grandfather's study, reviewing every detail of the strategy that would unfold in less than 24 hours. The leather-bound notebook where I had been tracking David and Angela's activities over the past months lay open beside the legal documents that would end both their careers. As I sipped my grandfather's favorite brandy and watched the sun set over Lincoln Park, I reflected on how completely David had misunderstood the woman he had married. He had spent 22 years believing that his success was entirely self-made, never realizing that his wife possessed both the knowledge and the power to destroy everything he had built. Tomorrow night, David would learn what happened when someone mistook patience for weakness and silence for ignorance. Angela would discover that ambitious women who built their careers on deception eventually encountered others who played the game at a much higher level. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the audience was assembled. All that remained was the performance itself. Saturday evening arrived with the crisp clarity of a perfect Chicago autumn night. The Riverside Country Club's private dining room glowed with warm candlelight as our guests began arriving for what they believed would be a traditional anniversary celebration. I had chosen to arrive early ostensibly to oversee the final details but actually to observe David and Angela's pre-dinner interactions without the distraction of managing social obligations. From my position near the bar, I watched David adjust his burgundy silk tie for the third time in 10 minutes. The same nervous gesture I had observed countless times before major business presentations. Tonight, however, The stakes were infinitely higher than any client pitch he had ever delivered. Angela stood beside him, radiant in a midnight blue cocktail dress that perfectly complemented the diamond engagement ring she wore on her right hand, ready to transfer to her left finger during what she believed would be her moment of triumph. The irony of their positioning wasn't lost on me. They had chosen to stand beneath the oil painting of Riverside's founding members, men who had built Chicago's industrial foundation through strategic patience and careful planning. My great-grandfather's portrait was among them, a reminder of the Hammond family's deep roots in this city's business establishment. David and Angela were about to learn that some traditions carried more weight than they had ever imagined. "Rebecca, darling, you look absolutely stunning tonight," called Margaret Winston, the wife of Charles Winston, one of Chicago's most influential private equity partners. Margaret approached with the confidence of someone who had never questioned her place in the city's social hierarchy, her emerald necklace catching the candlelight as she moved. "Thank you, Margaret," I replied, accepting her air kisses with practiced grace. "I'm so pleased you and Charles could join us for this special evening." Margaret's eyes sparkled with curiosity as she glanced toward David and Angela. "David seems particularly excited tonight." Charles mentioned that Richardson Consulting has been making quite an impression with some major potential clients lately. The comment was perfectly timed, since Charles Winston's private equity firm had been one of the venues where David and Angela had pitched their Martinez and Associates concept. Charles had no idea that his potential investment opportunity was actually a theft scheme targeting his hostess's family business. "David has always been ambitious," I agreed, sipping my champagne while maintaining perfect composure. "Tonight should certainly be memorable for everyone involved." As more guests arrived, the room filled with the comfortable buzz of Chicago's business elite engaging in their natural habitat. Venture capitalist Robert Chen discussed market trends with manufacturing heir Patricia Morrison. Corporate lawyer Stephen Blake compared notes on recent merger activity with real estate developer Jennifer Walsh. These weren't just social acquaintances. They were the decision-makers who shaped Chicago's economic landscape, and their presence tonight would ensure that whatever transpired would become part of the city's business folklore. David's business partner Michael Chan arrived with his wife Lisa, both looking slightly puzzled by the formal atmosphere. Michael had been expecting a casual anniversary dinner, not a gathering that resembled a corporate summit. His confusion was understandable, since David had carefully avoided mentioning the true nature of tonight's planned announcement to any of Richardson Consulting's employees. "Mrs. Richardson," Michael said as he approached, "this is quite an elegant celebration. David mentioned that you had something special planned, but he was mysteriously vague about the details." "David enjoys his surprises," I replied with a smile that carried multiple meanings. "I think everyone will find tonight's announcements quite illuminating." The plural form of announcements caught Michael's attention, though he was too polite to probe further. He had no way of knowing that while David planned to announce one major change in his life, I was prepared to announce several that would affect everyone connected to Richardson Consulting. Angela moved through the room with the confidence of someone who believed she was about to claim her rightful place among Chicago's power couples. She engaged effortlessly with the wives of major business figures, discussing art exhibitions and charity fundraisers with the ease of someone who had been practicing for this role. Her performance was flawless, which made the coming revelation even more satisfying. "Angela has become such an asset to Richardson Consulting," commented Susan Blake, Stephen Blake's wife and a prominent member of several cultural boards. "David is fortunate to have found someone who understands both the business and social dimensions of his work." "Indeed," I agreed, watching Angela's animated conversation with Margaret Winston about the upcoming Symphony Gala. Angela has certainly made herself indispensable in many ways. The double meaning wasn't lost on Susan, who had navigated Chicago's social circles long enough to recognize when conversations carried subtext. Her slight nod indicated that she understood more was happening tonight than a simple anniversary celebration. As the cocktail hour progressed, I noticed Crawford's security team operating with invisible efficiency throughout the club. 2 men in evening wear positioned themselves near the main exits, while a woman with professional camera equipment documented the gathering under the guise of society photography. Every conversation, every interaction, every moment of David and Angela's confidence was being preserved for future legal proceedings. Harrison Beck arrived precisely at 7:30, accompanied by his wife Eleanor, and carrying a leather briefcase that contained the legal documents that would transform this social gathering into a corporate tribunal. Harrison's presence might have seemed unusual at a personal anniversary celebration, but as Hammond Holdings' chief counsel, he often attended events where business and social obligations intersected. "Rebecca," Harrison said quietly as he approached, "everything is in position. The documentation is complete, and Patricia Williams has confirmed that the recording equipment is functioning properly." "Thank you, Harrison," I replied, noting how his calm demeanor contrasted with David's increasingly nervous energy. "I trust the timing will unfold exactly as we discussed." David had been watching my conversation with Harrison with growing curiosity, no doubt wondering why our family's lawyer was attending what was supposed to be a personal celebration. His confusion was another sign that despite 22 years of marriage, he had never fully understood the extent to which my personal and professional lives were integrated. At 8 o'clock, Patricia Williams appeared at my elbow with a discreet nod. "Mrs. Richardson, dinner is ready to be served. Shall I ask the guests to take their seats?" The moment had arrived. David straightened his tie one final time, took Angela's hand in a gesture of solidarity, and moved toward the head table where he would deliver what he believed would be his greatest performance. Angela's eyes shone with anticipation as she surveyed the distinguished gathering, mentally cataloging the business connections that would soon be available to advance her career. Neither of them noticed that the seating arrangement had been carefully designed to ensure maximum visibility for what was about to unfold. The head table, where David and Angela would make their announcement, was positioned so that every guest would have an unobstructed view of their faces when the evening's surprises began. As the guests settled into their assigned seats, the conversation naturally turned to business developments and social news, corporate merger rumors mixed with charity fundraising updates, creating the kind of atmosphere where major announcements felt natural and expected. "Ladies and gentlemen," David began, rising from his chair with the confidence of someone who had never questioned his authority. "Rebecca and I want to thank you all for joining us tonight to celebrate 22 years of marriage." The room quieted respectfully as David launched into what appeared to be a traditional anniversary toast. His voice carried the practiced warmth of someone accustomed to addressing business audiences, and his posture projected the confidence that had made him successful in Chicago's competitive consulting market. "When Rebecca and I first met at Northwestern, I knew I was in the presence of someone special," David continued, his gaze sweeping the room with practiced ease. "She has been my partner through every challenge and every triumph, supporting my dreams and helping build Richardson Consulting into the success it has become today." Several guests smiled at what seemed like a heartfelt tribute to a long marriage, unaware that David's words were actually the setup for a very different kind of announcement. Angela sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, waiting for the cue that would signal her moment to reveal the engagement ring and claim her new position. "However," David said, his tone shifting slightly, "honest relationships require acknowledging when circumstances change and when new chapters must begin." The subtle change in his delivery caught the attention of the more experienced business leaders in the room. Charles Winston's expression sharpened with interest, while Robert Chin leaned forward slightly, recognizing the rhetorical structure that typically preceded major business announcements. "After careful consideration and extensive planning," David continued, "I have decided that it's time to be completely transparent about my future, both personal and professional." Angela's breathing quickened almost imperceptibly as the moment approached. She had rehearsed her part in this performance dozens of times, practicing the gracious smile and humble acceptance speech that would establish her as David's partner in all aspects of his life. "The truth is," David said, his voice gaining strength as he approached the revelation he had been planning for months, "Rebecca and I have grown in different directions over the years. While I have tremendous respect for the woman she has been in my life, I believe that both of us deserve the opportunity to pursue relationships that better reflect who we have become." The room's energy shifted subtly as guests began to understand that they were witnessing something far more dramatic than a traditional anniversary toast. Margaret Winston exchanged a quick glance with her husband, while Harrison Beck's expression remained perfectly neutral despite knowing exactly what was coming next. "With that in mind," David continued, reaching for Angela's hand and drawing her to her feet beside him, "I want to introduce you to the woman who has become my true partner in every sense of the word." Angela Martinez, who many of you know as my executive assistant, has agreed to become my wife." Angela rose gracefully, her diamond ring catching the candlelight as she transferred it to her left hand with practiced elegance. Her smile was radiant and perfectly calibrated for the society photographers who were documenting the moment, and her posture projected the confidence of someone who believed she was claiming her rightful place among Chicago's power couples. Angela and I have spent the past year building not just a personal relationship, but a professional partnership that will benefit everyone connected to Richardson Consulting, David announced, his arms sliding possessively around Angela's waist. "She brings extraordinary business acumen and strategic insight that will help take the firm to new levels of success." The guests' reactions ranged from shocked silence to polite applause, with most people uncertain about the appropriate response to such an unexpected announcement. Several wives looked instinctively toward me, expecting tears or dramatics, while their husbands calculated the business implications of what they had just witnessed. "In fact," David continued, emboldened by what he interpreted as acceptance from the distinguished audience, "Angela and I are excited to announce that we will be launching our own consulting venture, Martinez and Associates, which will build upon the foundation we've established at Richardson Consulting while offering more innovative and personalized service to our clients." This second revelation caused a more noticeable stir among the business leaders present, who understood immediately that David was announcing his intention to compete directly with his current firm. Charles Winston's eyebrows rose slightly, while Robert Chen pulled out his phone to take notes about what was clearly becoming a significant business development. Angela stepped forward slightly, claiming her moment in the spotlight with the poise of someone who had been preparing for this opportunity her entire career. "I want to thank all of you for the warm welcome you've given me over the past 2 years," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the now silent room. "Working with David has taught me so much about building meaningful business relationships, and I'm excited about the opportunity to contribute to Chicago's business community in a more significant way." Her speech was perfectly crafted, acknowledging her previous subordinate role while positioning herself as an equal partner in both personal and professional contexts. She had clearly spent considerable time preparing for this moment, and her performance was flawless. "David and I believe that the consulting industry needs fresh approaches and more dynamic leadership," Angela continued, her confidence growing as she claimed the attention of Chicago's business elite. "Martinez and Associates will provide exactly the kind of innovative thinking that today's companies need to thrive in an increasingly competitive marketplace." The announcement was complete. David and Angela stood together at the head of the table, hands clasped, presenting themselves as Chicago's newest power couple and most exciting business partnership. They had successfully executed their plan to legitimize their relationship and their business venture in front of the city's most influential leaders. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the soft clicking of cameras and the gentle clink of crystal glasses as guests processed what they had just witnessed. David's smile was triumphant, while Angela's expression radiated satisfaction at having finally claimed the recognition she believed she deserved. Neither of them noticed that I had remained perfectly composed throughout their entire performance, my champagne glass steady in my hand, my expression calm and attentive. They were so focused on their moment of triumph that they failed to observe the subtle signs that their audience was waiting for something more. The anticipation in the room was palpable, as if the gathered business leaders instinctively understood that the evening's drama was far from complete. Margaret Winston watched me with barely concealed curiosity, while Charles Winston's expression suggested he was recalculating everything he thought he knew about the people involved. Harrison Beck checked his watch discreetly, confirming that the timing was proceeding exactly as planned. Crawford's security team maintained their positions, ready to ensure that no one left the room before the evening's final act played out completely. As David and Angela basked in what they believed was their moment of ultimate victory, I rose slowly from my chair, setting my champagne glass down with deliberate precision. The movement drew every eye in the room, and the anticipation became almost tangible as Chicago's business elite prepared to witness whatever came next. The stage was set for the revelation that would transform triumph into catastrophe and expose the difference between temporary success and permanent power. As I rose from my chair, the dining room fell into a silence so complete that the soft jazz music from the club's main lounge seemed to echo from another world. Every eye in the room fixed on me, and I could feel the weight of expectation from Chicago's business elite who sensed that the evening's drama was far from over. David's triumphant smile began to waver slightly as he registered my calm composure, while Angela's confident posture stiffened with the first hint of unease. "Thank you, David, for that illuminating announcement," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the crystal-clear silence. "I believe our guests deserve to hear the complete truth about Richardson Consulting and the exciting changes that lie ahead." I moved deliberately around the table, positioning myself where every guest could see my face clearly while David and Angela were forced to turn their backs to half the room. The subtle shift in dynamics was immediate. I now commanded the room's attention while they became reactive rather than proactive. Before we discuss the future, however, I think it's important to clarify some misconceptions about the past, I continued, noting how Harrison Beck had discreetly opened his briefcase and was preparing to distribute documents, particularly regarding the actual ownership structure of Richardson Consulting. David's expression shifted from confusion to alarm, as he began to sense that something was fundamentally wrong with the narrative he had just presented. Angela's eyes darted between me and the distinguished guests, her survival instincts beginning to register that their carefully planned announcement might not have proceeded as smoothly as they had believed. "Many of you have wondered how a small consulting firm managed to consistently attract such high-profile clients over the past decade," I said, allowing a slight smile to play at the corners of my mouth. "Tonight, I can finally share the answer to that question." Charles Winston leaned forward with undisguised interest, his venture capitalist instincts recognizing that he was about to witness something significant. Margaret Winston's eyes sparkled with anticipation, while the other business leaders around the room prepared to absorb information that would clearly reshape their understanding of Chicago's corporate landscape. "Richardson Consulting has never been an independent firm," I announced, watching as David's face drained of color. "From its inception, it has been a wholly owned subsidiary of Hammond Holdings, established specifically to provide my family with insights into the mid-market consulting industry." The words hung in the air like a physical presence, their implications rippling through the room as each guest processed what they had just heard. Robert Chen's mouth opened slightly in surprise, while Stephen Blake immediately began calculating the legal ramifications of what such an ownership structure would mean for David and Angela's announced business plans. Every major contract, every significant client relationship, every strategic decision has been guided by Hammond Holdings' long-term business objectives. I continued, enjoying the way David's confident posture was crumbling in real time. What David has always believed was his exceptional business acumen was actually my family's strategic networking applied to benefit a subsidiary operation. Angela's hand moved instinctively to grip the back of her chair as the reality of their situation began to penetrate her consciousness. The business plan she had spent months developing, the client relationships she had assumed would transfer to Martinez and Associates, the industry connection she had counted on leveraging, all of it was built on a foundation that had never actually existed. "This arrangement has worked well for over a decade," I said, accepting a folder from Harrison Beck and opening it with deliberate precision. "However, recent developments have made it necessary to reassess the management structure of our subsidiary operations." David finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Rebecca, what are you talking about? I built Richardson Consulting from nothing. I secured every client, developed every relationship." "Did you?" I interrupted gently, producing a thick document from Harrison's folder. "Let me share some details that might clarify the situation." I began reading from what was clearly a comprehensive audit report, my voice maintaining perfect composure as I detailed the systematic support that Hammond Holdings had provided to Richardson Consulting over the years. Each revelation was more devastating than the last, exposing how David's supposed business genius had been carefully orchestrated by people he had never even realized were involved. The Midwest manufacturing contract that launched Richardson Consulting into the major leagues, Hammond Holdings held a 30% stake in Midwest manufacturing and specifically recommended your firm for their restructuring project, I read, noting how David's legs seemed to be losing their ability to support him. "The Great Lakes Shipping Expansion Advisory that established your reputation for international consulting, My family has maintained business relationships with Great Lakes for 40 years, and their CEO personally requested that we provide guidance on selecting appropriate advisors. Angela's carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the pallor that was spreading across her face as she began to understand that every achievement she had attributed to her own strategic insights had been the result of invisible manipulation by forces she had never detected. The Denver Energy Consortium that provided your first major renewable energy consulting contract, Hammond Holdings Environmental Investment Division, had been planning that project for 3 years and needed a consulting firm with the appropriate expertise to facilitate the transition. With each revelation, David's world shrank further. The business empire he had believed was entirely his creation was being revealed as an elaborate construction project managed by his wife's family, with himself cast in the role of unwitting foreman rather than architect. But the most interesting recent development, I continued, my voice taking on a slightly sharper edge, has been the systematic theft of company resources to fund personal activities and unauthorized business development. Harrison Beck stood and began distributing copies of Crawford's investigation report to each guest, the rustle of papers creating a soundtrack of doom for David and Angela's rapidly collapsing future. The evidence was comprehensive and damning, detailing every misappropriated expense, every diverted resource, every breach of fiduciary duty they had committed over the past 18 months. Hotel accommodations charged to client entertainment budgets but used for personal vacations, I read from the report, watching as Angela's engagement ring seemed to grow heavier on her finger. Jewelry purchases written off as client gifts but retained for personal use. Business dinners for 2 at the city's most expensive restaurants, justified as strategic planning sessions. The distinguished guests around the room absorbed each detail with the fascination of people watching a masterclass in corporate fraud. Several were taking notes, recognizing that they were witnessing something that would become legendary in Chicago's business circles. Most concerning, however, has been the systematic sharing of proprietary Hammond Holdings information with unauthorized personnel, I continued, my gaze fixing directly on Angela. Confidential data about our acquisition strategies, competitive intelligence about our business partners, and strategic planning details that could provide significant advantages to potential competitors. Angela's composure finally cracked completely. David, you said, I thought the information was public. What information was public? David demanded, his own panic beginning to override his loyalty to his co-conspirator. I never shared any confidential information with you. The crack in their united front was exactly what I had been waiting for. Under pressure, their romantic partnership was dissolving into mutual recrimination, as each tried to preserve whatever remained of their individual positions. Actually, I said, producing another document from Harrison's seemingly endless supply of evidence. Our investigation has recorded numerous instances where both of you participated in discussions about Hammond Holdings' business activities, often while planning your competing venture. The recording transcripts were devastating. Page after page of conversations where David and Angela had casually discussed my family's business strategies, while developing plans to use that intelligence for their own benefit. Their pillow talk had become corporate espionage, and their romantic planning sessions had documented their crimes in exhaustive detail. Charles Winston cleared his throat, his venture capitalist experience allowing him to cut through the emotional drama to focus on the business implications. Rebecca, are you saying that the Martinez and Associates business plan we reviewed last month was based on stolen intellectual property and fraudulent client relationships? That's exactly what I'm saying, Charles, I replied, grateful for the opportunity to address the room's business leaders directly. Every client relationship they claim to control actually belongs to Hammond Holdings. Every strategic insight they plan to leverage was developed using my family's resources. Every competitive advantage they thought they possessed was based on access they were never authorized to have. The implications rippled through the room as each business leader recalculated their understanding of what they had witnessed. Robert Chen was visibly reviewing his notes about potential investment opportunities, while Stephen Blake was clearly considering the legal ramifications for anyone who might have been considering partnerships with the fraudulent venture. Furthermore, I continued, enjoying the way David and Angela were now standing as far apart as possible while remaining at the same table, Their engagement announcement tonight was apparently planned as a way to legitimize their theft of company resources and client relationships. Angela's voice came out as barely a whisper. That's not. We weren't trying to steal anything. We were building something new, something better. Using stolen client lists, misappropriated corporate funds, and confidential strategic information, Harrison Beck interjected, his legal expertise lending authority to the charges. That's not innovation, Ms. Martinez. That's organized theft. David made one final attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of his professional life. Even if Richardson Consulting was somehow connected to your family, I still built the actual business. I managed the client relationships, developed the methodologies, created the value. Did you? I asked, producing what appeared to be David's original employment contract from Harrison's briefcase. Let's review the exact terms under which you joined Richardson Consulting 15 years ago. I began reading from the contract, emphasizing clauses that David had apparently never fully understood despite having signed them. The language was complex, but unmistakable. David had never been an owner or partner in Richardson Consulting. He had been an employee, albeit a well-compensated one, whose authority existed solely at the discretion of Hammond Holdings. Section 12, paragraph 4, I read clearly, specifies that all client relationships, strategic methodologies, and business development activities remain the exclusive property of Richardson Consulting's parent company, with the understanding that the parent company may terminate this arrangement at any time for cause. The room was completely silent as the implications sank in. David had spent 15 years believing he was building his own empire, when in reality he had been working as a very well-paid manager of someone else's subsidiary operation. Cause for termination, I continued, is specifically defined to include misappropriation of company resources, unauthorized sharing of confidential information, and any attempt to compete with company interests using proprietary knowledge or client relationships. Angela's legs finally gave out, and she sank into her chair as the reality of their situation became undeniable. Every element of their planned future had been built on a foundation that had never actually existed. The business relationships, the industry connections, the strategic advantages they had counted on leveraging, all of it belonged to Hammond Holdings and could be withdrawn at will. Which brings us to tonight's actual announcement, I said, noting how Crawford's security team had moved to positions that would prevent any attempt to leave the dining room. Effective immediately, both David Richardson and Angela Martinez are terminated from all positions within Richardson Consulting and its affiliated operations. Harrison Beck stood and began distributing termination documents that had been prepared with the same thoroughness as every other aspect of the evening's revelations. The legal language was precise and comprehensive, eliminating any possibility that David or Angela could claim continued access to company resources or client relationships. Additionally, I continued, criminal charges will be filed Monday morning with the Illinois Attorney General's office regarding the systematic theft of company resources and the unauthorized disclosure of confidential business information. The transformation in the room's atmosphere was complete. What had begun as David and Angela's moment of triumph had become their professional execution, witnessed by the very people they had hoped would legitimize their new status as Chicago's rising power couple. Margaret Winston leaned toward her husband and whispered something that made him nod grimly. Several other guests were already calculating how quickly they could distance themselves from any association with the disgraced couple, while others were clearly preparing to share the evening's revelations with their own business networks. The transition of Richardson Consulting to direct Hammond Holdings management will begin Monday, I announced, addressing the room's business leaders rather than the two people whose careers I had just destroyed. Michael Chen will serve as interim managing director while we conduct a comprehensive search for permanent leadership. Michael Chen, who had been watching the proceedings with a mixture of shock and fascination, nodded his acceptance of the unexpected promotion. As Richardson Consulting's senior consultant, he was the logical choice to oversee the firm's transition to open Hammond Holdings control. For those of you who had business relationships with Richardson Consulting, I continued, please be assured that all legitimate client services will continue without interruption. However, any discussions or agreements involving Martinez and Associates should be considered null and void, since that entity was never authorized to exist. The business implications were staggering. Every deal David and Angela had negotiated, every contract they had discussed, Every partnership they had proposed was now revealed as fraud. The venture capital firms that had considered investing in Martinez and Associates would need to completely reassess their due diligence processes, while the companies that had been planning to hire their services would need to find alternative consulting arrangements. As the full scope of the evening's revelations settled over the room, David and Angela stood in complete isolation, their romantic partnership having devolved into mutual suspicion as each realized that their shared future had been built entirely on illusions. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft sound of Harrison Beck closing his briefcase and the discreet movement of Crawford's security team ensuring that no evidence could be removed from the scene. Chicago's business elite had witnessed something that would be discussed in boardrooms and country clubs for years to come: the complete destruction of two people who had mistaken temporary access to power for permanent ownership of it. The minutes following my revelation unfolded like a carefully choreographed corporate demolition, each consequence cascading into the next with devastating precision. David stood frozen at the head table, his burgundy tie now askew, and his face bearing the ashen pallor of someone whose entire reality had just collapsed. Angela had slumped back into her chair, her diamond engagement ring catching the candlelight in what now seemed like a mockery of her earlier triumph. The first person to break the profound silence was Charles Winston, his venture capitalist instincts immediately shifting into damage control mode. "Rebecca," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to managing crisis situations, "I believe my firm needs to schedule an immediate meeting to discuss certain investment considerations that may have been based on incomplete information." His diplomatic phrasing couldn't disguise the reality that Martinez and Associates had just been exposed as a fraud scheme, and anyone who had considered investing in David and Angela's venture would need to completely reassess their due diligence processes. The ripple effects would extend far beyond Richardson Consulting into Chicago's broader investment community. "Of course, Charles," I replied smoothly, noting how several other guests were already reaching for their phones to begin their own damage control communications. "Harrison Beck will coordinate with your legal team to ensure all relevant documentation is properly shared." Margaret Winston leaned toward Patricia Morrison, whispering urgently about the implications for their various charitable boards where David had been cultivating influence. The social dimensions of his downfall were as significant as the business consequences, since Chicago's elite circles valued reputation above almost everything else. Angela finally found her voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "This is impossible. David, tell them this is some kind of mistake. You built Richardson Consulting. You told me." "What exactly did I tell you?" David snapped, his panic beginning to override whatever loyalty remained between them. "I never claimed to own anything. I never said we could just take client relationships and start our own firm." The crack in their united front widened into a chasm as Angela's survival instincts kicked in. "You absolutely did tell me that. You said Richardson Consulting was your company, that you had built it from nothing, that the clients were loyal to you personally." Their public argument provided exactly the kind of evidence that would prove invaluable in any criminal prosecution. Crawford's recording equipment was capturing every word as their romantic partnership dissolved into mutual recrimination, each trying to shift blame to the other for their shared crimes. Harrison Beck stood and addressed the room with the calm authority of someone who had managed dozens of similar corporate crises. "Ladies and gentlemen, I understand this has been an unusual evening. For those who may have business interests affected by tonight's revelations, my office will be available Monday morning to address any concerns or questions." His announcement served multiple purposes. It established Hammond Holdings as the responsible party managing the crisis. It provided a clear process for business leaders to protect their interests, and it reinforced the legitimacy of the legal actions that would follow. Robert Chen raised his hand slightly, his private equity background making him acutely aware of the regulatory implications. "Rebecca, will there be any SEC involvement given the scope of the financial irregularities?" "That decision will be made by the appropriate federal authorities," I replied, noting how David's face grew even paler at the mention of Securities and Exchange Commission oversight. "Hammond Holdings will cooperate fully with any investigation that federal agencies deem necessary." The mention of federal involvement sent another wave of panic through David and Angela. What had seemed like a simple case of workplace romance and business ambition was rapidly expanding into potential federal crimes with serious prison sentences. Stephen Blake, drawing on his extensive corporate law experience, asked the question that several other guests were clearly considering. What about clients who may have signed contracts or made commitments based on representations from Martinez and Associates? Any agreements involving Martinez and Associates are void ab initio, Harrison Beck replied immediately, using the Latin legal term that meant from the beginning. Since the entity never had legitimate authority to enter into business relationships, any contracts or commitments are legally meaningless. The implications were staggering for Chicago's business community. Companies that had been planning to hire Martinez and Associates would need to find alternative consulting arrangements, while firms that had already signed preliminary agreements would need to completely restart their vendor selection processes. Angela's phone began buzzing incessantly as news of the evening's events started spreading through Chicago's interconnected business networks. Her face grew increasingly desperate as she realized that her professional reputation was being destroyed in real time, with each incoming call likely bringing news of another business relationship that was being severed. "I need to call my lawyer," David said suddenly, his survival instincts finally overriding his shock. There has to be some kind of mistake, some kind of misunderstanding." "By all means," I replied calmly, though I should mention that any attempt to contact clients or remove company property will be considered additional evidence of criminal intent. Crawford's security team had been monitoring David and Angela's electronic communications throughout the evening, ensuring that they couldn't delete evidence or warn potential co-conspirators about their exposure. Every text message, every phone call, every email would be preserved for the criminal investigation that would begin Monday morning. Michael Chen approached me quietly, his expression a mixture of shock and professional concern. "Mrs. Richardson, Ms. Hammond, what does this mean for the rest of us at Richardson Consulting? For our employees, our ongoing client work?" His question demonstrated exactly the kind of responsible leadership that would be essential for managing the firm's transition to direct Hammond Holdings control. Unlike David and Angela, Michael was focused on protecting the legitimate interests of employees and clients rather than trying to salvage his own position. "Michael, the consulting work will continue without interruption," I assured him. "In fact, we're planning to expand Richardson Consulting's capabilities significantly now that we can openly leverage Hammond Holdings' full network and resources." The announcement sent a visible wave of relief through several guests who had business relationships with Richardson Consulting. They were learning that their consulting arrangements would not only continue, but potentially improve under the new management structure. "What about our contracts? Our retainer agreements?" asked Jennifer Walsh, whose real estate development firm had been working with Richardson Consulting on a major mixed-use project. "All legitimate client relationships will be honored and enhanced," I replied. "You'll actually have access to additional resources and expertise that weren't previously available through the subsidiary structure." The contrast between David and Angela's criminal exposure and the opportunity for legitimate business relationships to flourish was stark. While their fraud scheme was being dismantled, the actual consulting business would emerge stronger and more capable than ever. Angela made one final desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage. "Rebecca, surely we can work something out. I made mistakes, but I genuinely believed." David led me to believe. "I never intended to steal anything." "Ms. Martinez," Harrison Beck interjected, before I could respond, "any discussions about your legal situation should be conducted through appropriate counsel. I would strongly advise against making any additional statements tonight." His warning was both professional courtesy and strategic necessity. Angela's continued attempts to explain her actions were only providing additional evidence of her guilty knowledge about the crimes she and David had committed. The social dynamics in the room had completely shifted. Earlier in the evening, David and Angela had been the center of attention, accepting congratulations and discussing their exciting future plans. Now they stood isolated, avoided by guests who were calculating how to distance themselves from the scandal as quickly as possible. Margaret Winston approached me with the practical concern that always accompanied major social disruptions in Chicago's elite circles. "Rebecca, dear, what should we tell people who weren't here tonight? There will be questions about David's position with various charitable boards, social committees. Tell them the truth, I replied simply. David Richardson was an employee of a Hammond Holdings subsidiary who exceeded his authority and violated his fiduciary duties. He has been terminated, and criminal charges are pending. The elegant simplicity of that explanation would serve perfectly for Chicago's social networks. It provided all the necessary information while avoiding the kind of dramatic speculation that could complicate the legal proceedings. Patricia Williams, the club's general manager, approached with the discreet professionalism that had made Riverside Country Club the preferred venue for Chicago's most sensitive business discussions. Mrs. Hammond, shall I arrange for private transportation for Mr. Richardson and Ms. Martinez? The offer was both practical and strategic. Having David and Angela escorted from the club by Crawford's security team would prevent any attempt to remain and argue their case, while also ensuring that they couldn't approach other guests to spread their version of events. That would be appropriate, I agreed, noting how David's shoulders slumped at the realization that he was being treated as a security risk rather than a guest of honor. As Crawford's team prepared to escort them out, Angela made one final appeal to the room's business leaders. Please, everyone needs to understand that we never intended to hurt anyone. We were building something legitimate, something that would have benefited everyone. Her words fell into complete silence. Chicago's business elite had heard enough criminal confessions for one evening, and no one was interested in providing Angela with additional opportunities to incriminate herself. David's final words were directed at me, his voice carrying a mixture of desperation and bewilderment. Rebecca, after 22 years of marriage, how could you do this? How could you humiliate me like this in front of everyone we know? The question revealed how completely he had missed the point of everything that had transpired. Even facing criminal prosecution and complete professional destruction, David still believed that his public humiliation was the primary issue rather than his systematic theft and betrayal. David, I replied with calm finality, you humiliated yourself. I simply provided the appropriate audience for your confession. As Crawford's security team escorted David and Angela from the dining room, the remaining guests began the delicate process of processing what they had witnessed. Business cards were exchanged as people prepared to coordinate their responses to the evening's revelations, while others made quiet phone calls to warn colleagues about the implications of what had just transpired. Harrison Beck began scheduling follow-up meetings with the business leaders who would need legal guidance about extracting themselves from any entanglements with David and Angela's fraudulent schemes. His calm efficiency was helping to restore order to what could have become a chaotic situation. The transformation of the evening was complete. What had begun as David and Angela's triumph had become their public execution, witnessed by exactly the people they had hoped would validate their new status. Instead of launching their business empire, they had provided the evidence necessary to send them to federal prison. As the immediate crisis management continued around me, I reflected on the elegant simplicity of what had just transpired. David and Angela had spent months planning their perfect announcement, believing they were orchestrating my humiliation and their ascension to Chicago's business elite. Instead, they had assembled exactly the right audience to witness their own destruction and to validate my emergence as the true power behind Richardson Consulting. Their moment of triumph had become my coronation, and their romantic partnership had dissolved into mutual recrimination under the pressure of their shared crimes. The evening's final irony was that David and Angela had achieved exactly what they had set out to accomplish. They had definitively ended my role as the quiet, supportive wife who remained in the background of her husband's business success. They simply hadn't anticipated that the woman who emerged from that role would possess both the knowledge and the power to destroy everything they had tried to steal. The weeks following the anniversary dinner revelation unfolded with the methodical precision of a masterclass in corporate restructuring and criminal justice. As Chicago's business community digested the implications of what they had witnessed, the machinery of legal consequence and professional transformation began operating with devastating efficiency. Monday morning arrived with the crisp clarity of a new era. I sat in my grandfather's office, my office now, watching the sunrise paint the Chicago skyline in shades of gold and amber. The Hammond Holdings headquarters buzzed with activity as our legal team prepared the criminal referrals that would send David and Angela's case to federal prosecutors, while our business development team began the process of openly integrating Richardson Consulting into our corporate structure. The first call came from Thomas Crawford at exactly 8 o'clock, his security firm having monitored David and Angela's activities throughout the weekend. "Rebecca," his voice carried a note of professional satisfaction, "you'll be interested to know that both subjects attempted to access Richardson Consulting's offices Saturday night. Building security denied them entry, but their attempts were fully documented. The attempted break-in provided additional evidence of criminal intent, demonstrating that even after their public exposure, David and Angela had been planning to remove or destroy evidence. Their desperation was both predictable and legally damaging, since it showed conscious guilt rather than innocent misunderstanding." "What about their electronic communications?" I asked, settling into the leather chair that had been my grandfather's command center for 4 decades. "Extensive," Crawford replied with evident satisfaction. "Angela spent most of Sunday trying to contact former clients, apparently attempting to convince them that Richardson Consulting's ownership change was some kind of hostile takeover rather than exposure of fraud. David made similar calls, claiming that Hammond Holdings was illegally seizing assets that belonged to him personally. Their continued attempts to contact clients and spread false information about the ownership structure were providing prosecutors with real-time evidence of ongoing criminal activity. Each phone call, each email, each social media post was being documented as additional counts for the federal indictment that would be filed within days. The second significant development came from Harrison Beck, who arrived at 9:30 with updates on the regulatory response to Saturday's revelations. "The Illinois Attorney General's office has formally accepted our criminal referral," he announced, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Federal prosecutors are reviewing the case for potential charges including wire fraud, mail fraud, and violation of federal computer crime statutes." The scope of potential federal charges was staggering. What had begun as workplace infidelity and creative expense account management had evolved into multiple federal felonies carrying potential sentences of 20 years or more in federal prison. "More importantly," Harrison continued, "the Securities and Exchange Commission has opened a preliminary investigation into potential securities fraud related to their Martinez and Associates presentations to venture capital firms. The SEC investigation represented David and Angela's worst nightmare, since federal securities fraud carried some of the most severe penalties in white-collar criminal law. Their presentations to potential investors, which had included false claims about client relationships and proprietary business methodologies, could result in additional decades of federal prison time." The third major development arrived in the form of Michael Chen, who had spent the weekend conducting emergency meetings with Richardson Consulting's employees and clients. His leadership during the crisis had been exemplary, demonstrating exactly the kind of professional competence that would be essential for the firm's successful transition. "Rebecca," Michael said as he entered with a comprehensive status report, "I've completed individual meetings with all of our major clients. Without exception, they've expressed relief about the ownership clarification and enthusiasm about accessing Hammond Holdings' full resources. The client's response was exactly what I had anticipated. Rather than viewing the ownership revelation as a problem, sophisticated business leaders understood that their consulting firm was actually backed by significantly more resources and expertise than they had previously realized." "What about the employee situation?" I asked, noting that Michael's report included detailed personnel assessments. "Everyone wants to stay," he replied with evident satisfaction. Once they understood the truth about David and Angela's activities, the entire team expressed gratitude for the stability that Hammond Holdings' ownership provides. The contrast between the employees' reactions and David's assumptions was striking. While David had believed that people were loyal to him personally, the reality was that talented professionals valued job security and legitimate business opportunities above personal relationships with management. The morning's fourth significant update came from Patricia Williams at Riverside Country Club, who called to report on the social aftermath of Saturday's dinner. "Rebecca, I thought you should know that we've received over 30 calls from members requesting information about hosting similar events. Apparently, Saturday's dinner is being viewed as the definitive example of how to handle sensitive business transitions. The social response was both gratifying and strategically valuable. Rather than viewing Saturday's events as scandalous or inappropriate, Chicago's business elite had recognized the elegant professionalism with which I had managed a complex corporate crisis. My reputation within the city's power structure had been enhanced rather than damaged by the evening's revelations. The week's most satisfying development came Thursday afternoon, when Crawford's surveillance team reported that David and Angela's romantic relationship had completely disintegrated under the pressure of their shared legal jeopardy. They're now living separately and have retained different criminal defense attorneys, Crawford reported during our weekly briefing. Angela's lawyer is apparently exploring plea bargain options, while David's counsel is maintaining that he was somehow victimized by Hammond Holdings' business practices. Their contradictory legal strategies were providing prosecutors with additional leverage, since defendants who blamed each other were essentially building the government's case through their mutual recriminations. The romance that had seemed so powerful during their anniversary announcement had proven remarkably fragile when tested by actual adversity. The second week brought the formal criminal indictments, which were unsealed during a press conference that established Hammond Holdings as the victim of systematic fraud, rather than a vengeful family pursuing personal revenge. The charges were comprehensive and devastating: conspiracy to commit fraud, wire fraud, mail fraud, computer crimes, securities fraud, and racketeering under the federal RICO statutes. The investigation has revealed a sophisticated scheme to steal corporate resources and proprietary business information, announced U.S. Attorney Jennifer Morrison during the press conference. The defendants used their positions of trust to systematically defraud their employer while planning to compete using stolen assets and confidential information. The federal prosecutor's characterization of their crimes perfectly captured the scope of David and Angela's betrayal. They weren't star-crossed lovers who had made poor choices. They were career criminals who had used romance as cover for systematic theft. The media coverage was extensive and uniformly negative for David and Angela. Chicago Tribune's business section ran a detailed analysis of how their fraud scheme had exploited the trust-based relationships that characterized the city's business community. The Wall Street Journal published an investigation into how venture capital due diligence had failed to detect the fraudulent basis of Martinez and Associates' business plan. Most satisfying was the Chicago Business Journal's feature article about Hammond Holdings' emergence as a major force in the consulting industry. The revelation of Hammond Holdings' ownership of Richardson Consulting has positioned the company to become a dominant player in the Midwest's business consulting market, the article noted. Industry experts expect significant growth as clients gain access to the parent company's extensive resources and network. The third week brought Angela's plea agreement, which provided prosecutors with comprehensive insider testimony about David's role as the primary architect of their criminal enterprise. Her cooperation was both predictable and devastating, since she possessed detailed knowledge of every aspect of their fraud scheme. Angela Martinez has agreed to provide complete testimony about the systematic theft of corporate resources and proprietary information, Harrison Beck reported after reviewing the plea documents. In exchange for her cooperation, federal prosecutors have agreed to recommend a reduced sentence of 5 to 7 years in federal prison. Angela's plea agreement effectively ended any possibility that David could mount a successful defense, since his co-conspirator would be testifying against him, with complete knowledge of their crimes. Her decision to cooperate also demonstrated how thoroughly their romantic partnership had been destroyed by the pressure of criminal prosecution. David's trial was scheduled for the following year, though his attorneys were already discussing plea negotiations, given the overwhelming evidence against him. The prospect of facing a federal jury with his former lover testifying about their crimes was sufficiently daunting that even David's ego was beginning to acknowledge the reality of his situation. The fourth week brought the formal transition of Richardson Consulting to direct Hammond Holdings management, with Michael Chen being promoted to President and Chief Operating Officer. The announcement was accompanied by news of a major expansion that would triple the firm's professional staff and establish satellite offices in Milwaukee, Indianapolis, and St. Louis. Richardson Consulting's integration into Hammond Holdings represents a significant expansion of our professional services capabilities, I announced during the press conference that introduced the new management structure. Our clients will now have access to resources and expertise that reflect 4 generations of business leadership and strategic planning. The expansion announcement generated significant positive media coverage and immediately attracted inquiries from potential clients who wanted access to Hammond Holdings' broader network. The consulting firm that David had believed was his personal empire was flourishing under legitimate management in ways that exceeded his most ambitious projections. The fifth week brought personal closure as well as professional transformation. The divorce proceedings with David were finalized with remarkable efficiency, since our prenuptial agreement had anticipated exactly this type of situation. David's claims to any marital assets were quickly dismissed once the scope of his criminal activities became clear to the family court judge. Mr. Richardson's fraudulent activities have voided any claims he might have had to marital property, the judge ruled during the brief hearing. His systematic theft of corporate resources constitutes a breach of the fiduciary duties that formed the basis of the prenuptial agreement. The legal language was technical, but the practical result was simple. David would leave our marriage with nothing except his criminal defense legal bills and the prospect of decades in federal prison. More importantly, the divorce proceedings provided an opportunity to formally change my name back to Hammond, signaling my complete transition from David's supportive wife to the acknowledged leader of my family's business empire. The sixth week brought the completion of Richardson Consulting's physical integration into Hammond Holdings headquarters, with the consulting firm's operations moving to an entire floor of our LaSalle Street building. The renovation included state-of-the-art conference facilities, advanced technology infrastructure, and direct access to Hammond Holdings' research and analysis capabilities. The physical integration represents the final step in Richardson Consulting's transition to full Hammond Holdings operations, Michael Chen explained during the ribbon-cutting ceremony that officially opened the new facilities. Our clients now have access to resources that reflect the full scope of a major corporate enterprise. The ceremony was attended by many of the same business leaders who had witnessed David and Angela's destruction at the anniversary dinner. The contrast between that evening's dramatic revelations and this celebration of legitimate business success was both satisfying and symbolically powerful. The seventh week brought news of David's final plea agreement, negotiated as his trial date approached, and the evidence against him became increasingly overwhelming. Rather than face a federal jury with Angela testifying about their crimes, David accepted a plea deal that would send him to federal prison for 12 to 15 years. David Richardson has accepted responsibility for his role in the systematic fraud that targeted Hammond Holdings and its business partners, his defense attorney announced during the plea hearing. He acknowledges that his actions were inexcusable and expresses remorse for the harm he has caused. The formal apology was legally required but personally meaningless, since David's remorse had emerged only after his criminal exposure made continued denial impossible. His cooperation with prosecutors was motivated by self-preservation rather than genuine accountability. The eighth week brought the most satisfying development of all: Richardson Consulting's announcement of its largest contract in company history, a comprehensive business transformation project for a Fortune 500 manufacturing company that would generate over $50 million in revenue over 3 years. This contract represents exactly the kind of opportunity that becomes available when clients understand they're working with Hammond Holdings' full capabilities, I explained during the client signing ceremony. Our ability to provide comprehensive strategic guidance reflects resources that extend far beyond traditional consulting arrangements. The contract signing was attended by senior executives from across Chicago's business community, many of whom were immediately interested in exploring similar arrangements with Richardson Consulting. The firm that David had nearly destroyed through his criminal activities was achieving success that exceeded his most optimistic projections. The ninth week brought personal satisfaction as well as professional triumph. The Chicago Business Hall of Fame announced that I would be inducted as the youngest woman ever to receive the honor, recognizing both my leadership of Hammond Holdings and my management of the Richardson Consulting crisis. Rebecca Hammond's handling of a complex corporate crisis demonstrates the kind of strategic leadership that defines Chicago's business excellence, the Hall of Fame committee announced. Her ability to transform a potentially damaging situation into an opportunity for growth and expansion exemplifies the entrepreneurial spirit that drives our city's economic success. The recognition was particularly meaningful because it acknowledged my business leadership independent of any family connections or inherited advantages. I had earned respect through my own strategic decisions and crisis management capabilities. The 10th week brought the final resolution of all legal proceedings, with both David and Angela beginning their federal prison sentences. David was assigned to a medium security facility in Indiana, while Angela was sent to a minimum security prison camp in Ohio. Their sentences would effectively end any possibility of future careers in business or finance. The conclusion of the criminal proceedings allows everyone affected by this situation to move forward with confidence, Harrison Beck announced during a final press conference. Hammond Holdings and Richardson Consulting can now focus entirely on serving clients and growing their businesses. The legal closure was both practically and symbolically important, since it eliminated any lingering uncertainty about the legitimacy of our business operations. The criminal convictions had validated every aspect of our response to David and Angela's fraud scheme. As I stood in my grandfather's office on a Friday evening 3 months after the anniversary dinner, watching the sun set over the Chicago skyline, I reflected on how completely my life had been transformed. The quiet, supportive wife who had attended charity luncheons and corporate dinners had emerged as the acknowledged leader of a major business enterprise. The transformation had required patience, strategic planning, and the willingness to wait for exactly the right moment to reveal my true capabilities. David and Angela had provided that moment through their arrogance and criminal behavior, creating the perfect opportunity for me to step out of the shadows and claim my rightful position. Richardson Consulting was thriving under its new management, with a client roster that exceeded David's most ambitious dreams and a professional staff that appreciated working for a legitimate business rather than a fraud scheme. The firm's success reflected the advantages that became available when operations were conducted with integrity rather than deception. Hammond Holdings had emerged from the crisis stronger and more visible than ever, with our business network understanding that we possessed both the resources to support major initiatives and the decisiveness to protect our interests when threatened. The family's reputation for strategic patience and decisive action had been enhanced, rather than damaged by the public exposure of David's crimes. Most importantly, I had discovered that the leadership skills my grandfather had spent decades developing were more powerful and effective than I had ever imagined. The quiet observation and strategic planning that had characterized my role as David's wife had actually been preparation for assuming control of a business empire that spanned multiple industries and continents. The anniversary dinner that David and Angela had planned as their moment of triumph had become my coronation as the true power behind Hammond Holdings. Their attempt to humiliate me had instead provided the perfect stage for demonstrating exactly who controlled the resources they had tried to steal. As I prepared to leave the office that Friday evening, I paused at my grandfather's portrait, thinking about the lessons he had taught me about patience, timing, and the strategic use of power. Wait for the moment when they're most confident, he had always said. That's when they're most vulnerable. David and Angela had provided exactly that moment, believing they were orchestrating my defeat, while actually arranging their own destruction. Their arrogance had made them blind to the reality that the quiet woman they had dismissed possessed both the knowledge and the power to destroy everything they had tried to build. The story that had begun with a secretary's ambition and a husband's betrayal had ended with criminal convictions and business triumph. The woman who had played the supporting role for 22 years had finally stepped onto center stage, revealing herself as the true architect of everything that had seemed to be someone else's success. Chicago's business community would remember the anniversary dinner revelation for decades, but not as the story of a woman's humiliation. Instead, it would be remembered as the perfect example of how real power operates, quietly, patiently, and decisively when the moment demands action. The quiet wife had become the acknowledged queen, and the business empire that had operated in shadows was now flourishing in the light of complete legitimacy. David and Angela had wanted to steal my husband's company, never realizing that they were actually attempting to rob the true owner of her own business. Their mistake had cost them their freedom, their careers, and their futures. My patience had been rewarded with complete victory, and the satisfaction of knowing that justice had been served with elegant precision. As I walked through the Hammond Holdings headquarters that Friday evening, surrounded by the portraits of 4 generations of family business leaders, I understood that my grandfather's greatest gift hadn't been the company itself. It had been the knowledge and patience necessary to protect it from those who would try to take what they had never earned. The lesson would serve me well in the years ahead, as Hammond Holdings continued to grow and prosper under leadership that understood the difference between temporary authority and permanent power. 6 months after the anniversary dinner, Richardson Consulting had become the fastest-growing mid-market consulting firm in the Midwest, with a client waiting list that extended into the following year. The integration with Hammond Holdings had unlocked opportunities that David could never have imagined, including international consulting contracts that leveraged our family's global business relationships. The firm's success attracted attention from Harvard Business School, which requested permission to develop a case study about the strategic management of corporate crisis and ownership transition. Professor Elizabeth Martinez, no relation to Angela, spent 3 weeks interviewing key participants and analyzing the business methodologies that had enabled such rapid growth following the ownership revelation. What makes this case particularly fascinating, Professor Martinez explained during her final presentation to our executive team, is how the crisis actually accelerated business development rather than damaging it. Most ownership disputes result in client defection and operational disruption. Hammond Holdings achieved the opposite outcome through strategic transparency and enhanced service delivery. The academic recognition was gratifying, but the practical benefits were even more significant. Business schools across the country began including our case in their crisis management and strategic planning curricula, establishing Hammond Holdings as a model for effective corporate governance and family business succession. The 7th month brought an unexpected opportunity when Charles Winston approached me about a joint venture that would combine Hammond Holdings' resources with his private equity firm's deal sourcing capabilities. The partnership would create the largest independent consulting and investment advisory practice in the Midwest, with combined assets under management exceeding $2 billion. Rebecca, your handling of the Richardson situation demonstrated exactly the kind of strategic thinking that our industry needs, Charles explained during our lunch meeting at the Chicago Club. Margaret and I have been discussing this opportunity for months, and we believe a formal partnership would benefit both organizations significantly. The Winston partnership represented validation from Chicago's most sophisticated investment community. Charles had witnessed David's destruction firsthand, and his willingness to enter a major business relationship with Hammond Holdings demonstrated that the events had enhanced rather than damaged our reputation among serious business leaders. The 8th month brought news that David's federal prison sentence had been increased following additional charges related to tax evasion and money laundering. Prosecutors had discovered that his theft of Richardson Consulting resources had extended beyond simple expense account fraud to systematic manipulation of the firm's financial records for personal benefit. David Richardson's criminal activities were far more extensive than initially realized, announced Assistant U.S. Attorney Robert Chen during a supplemental sentencing hearing. The additional charges reflect a pattern of financial crimes that began shortly after his employment commenced and continued throughout his tenure with the firm. The extended sentence meant that David would spend nearly 2 decades in federal prison, effectively ending any possibility that he could resume a business career upon his release. His transformation from successful executive to federal prisoner was complete and irreversible. Angela's cooperation with prosecutors had earned her a reduced sentence, but her career prospects remained permanently damaged. No legitimate business would hire someone with a federal fraud conviction, and her attempts to start an independent consulting practice had failed when potential clients discovered her criminal background during routine due diligence checks. The 9th month marked Richardson Consulting's expansion into international markets, with new offices opening in London, Toronto, and Mexico City. The global expansion was facilitated by Hammond Holdings' existing international business relationships, providing Richardson Consulting with established networks and credible references that would have taken David decades to develop independently. Our international expansion represents opportunities that become available when clients understand they're working with a global business network rather than a regional consulting firm, Michael Chen explained during the London office opening ceremony. Hammond Holdings' international relationships provide credibility and access that independent consultants simply cannot match. The London expansion was particularly satisfying because it demonstrated how legitimate business development differed from David's fraudulent approaches. Rather than stealing relationships or misrepresenting capabilities, Richardson Consulting was building sustainable international operations through systematic investment and authentic partnership development. The 10th month brought personal recognition when Chicago Magazine named me Executive of the Year, acknowledging both my business leadership and my role in exposing corporate fraud within the city's business community. The award ceremony was attended by over 500 business leaders, including many who had witnessed the anniversary dinner revelation. Rebecca Hammond's leadership exemplifies the principled business practices that define Chicago's corporate excellence, the magazine's editor announced during the award presentation. Her ability to transform a personal crisis into an opportunity for business growth and ethical leadership demonstrates the entrepreneurial spirit that drives our city's economic success. The recognition was meaningful because it acknowledged my business accomplishments independent of the criminal prosecution that had removed David and Angela from the picture. I had earned respect through strategic decision-making and effective leadership, rather than simply through exposing others' crimes. The 11th month brought the completion of Hammond Holdings' acquisition of 2 additional consulting firms, creating a comprehensive professional services network that spanned accounting, legal, strategic planning, and operational consulting. The acquisitions were funded through the increased revenue that had resulted from Richardson Consulting's successful integration and expansion. These acquisitions represent the natural evolution of our professional services capabilities, I explained during the announcement press conference. Our clients increasingly require comprehensive business support that extends beyond traditional consulting into specialized expertise areas. The acquisitions demonstrated how David's criminal activities had actually accelerated Hammond Holdings' strategic development. The crisis had forced us to examine our consulting operations more carefully, revealing opportunities for growth and integration that might have remained hidden if David had continued his fraudulent management practices. The 12th month marked the first anniversary of David and Angela's conviction, an occasion that prompted reflection on how completely our business landscape had been transformed. Richardson Consulting's revenue had increased by 400%, its professional staff had grown from 12 to over 60 employees, and its client roster included some of the most prestigious companies in North America. The contrast between Richardson Consulting's current success and its previous limitations illustrates the difference between legitimate business development and fraudulent operations, Harrison Beck observed during our annual legal review. David's criminal activities were actually constraining the firm's growth potential rather than enhancing it. The legal perspective was particularly valuable because it highlighted how David's fraud had been self-defeating, even from a purely business standpoint. His theft of company resources and misrepresentation of capabilities had prevented Richardson Consulting from accessing the legitimate opportunities that became available once Hammond Holdings' ownership was publicly acknowledged. The 13th month brought an invitation to speak at the National Association of Corporate Directors annual conference, where I was asked to present a session on crisis management and corporate governance. The presentation was attended by over 800 board members and senior executives from across the United States. Effective crisis management requires understanding the difference between tactical responses and strategic positioning, I explained during my keynote presentation. The most successful outcomes emerge when organizations use crisis situations to accelerate positive changes that were already strategically necessary. The speaking engagement established me as a recognized expert in corporate crisis management, leading to additional consulting opportunities with companies facing their own governance challenges. Hammond Holdings' reputation for effective crisis resolution was creating new business opportunities that extended far beyond our traditional industry focus areas. The 14th month brought news of David's unsuccessful appeal of his federal conviction, with the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals unanimously affirming both his guilt and his sentence. The appellate decision included language that validated every aspect of our response to his criminal activities. The defendant's systematic theft of corporate resources and proprietary information constituted a sophisticated fraud scheme that warranted the substantial sentence imposed by the district court, the appellate judges wrote in their unanimous opinion. The evidence of premeditation and ongoing criminal conduct supports the trial court's determination that significant deterrent measures were necessary. The appellate affirmation provided final legal validation that our exposure of David's crimes had been both factually accurate and procedurally appropriate. Any lingering questions about whether our response had been proportionate to his offenses were definitively resolved by federal judges who had reviewed the complete evidence record. The 15th month marked Richardson Consulting's recognition as Consulting Firm of the Year by the Midwest Business Review, an honor that reflected both its rapid growth and its innovative service delivery approaches. The award ceremony was attended by representatives from consulting firms across the region, many of whom were eager to understand how Richardson Consulting had achieved such dramatic success. Richardson Consulting's transformation demonstrates how legitimate business practices ultimately outperform fraudulent approaches, the award presenter notes during the ceremony. Their success reflects the advantages that emerge when operations are conducted with complete transparency and authentic client focus. The industry recognition was particularly meaningful because it came from competitors who had observed Richardson Consulting's transformation from the perspective of market participants, rather than media observers. Their acknowledgement of our success carried more weight than general business press coverage because it reflected professional respect from industry peers. As I stood in my office on the evening of the 15th month anniversary, reviewing financial reports that showed Hammond Holdings' continued growth and expansion, I reflected on how the anniversary dinner revelation had become a catalyst for business development that exceeded my most optimistic projections. David and Angela's criminal scheme had forced me to examine every aspect of our operations, revealing opportunities for improvement and expansion that might have remained hidden under normal circumstances. Their attempted theft had actually accelerated strategic initiatives that were transforming Hammond Holdings into a more capable and influential organization. The consulting industry recognition, the academic case studies, the international expansion, and the additional acquisitions all reflected opportunities that became available because the crisis had forced us to operate with complete transparency about our capabilities and resources. David's fraud had inadvertently created the conditions for unprecedented business growth. Most importantly, the experience had demonstrated that principled business practices ultimately generated better outcomes than fraudulent approaches, even when the fraud initially appeared successful. David's criminal activities had seemed profitable in the short term, but they had actually prevented him from accessing the legitimate opportunities that became available once his deception was exposed. The anniversary dinner that was supposed to humiliate me had instead become the launching point for the most successful period in Hammond Holdings' history, proving that authentic power always prevails over temporary deception when the stakes are high enough to matter. The 16th month brought an unexpected development when the Federal Bureau of Investigation requested our assistance in training their white-collar crime division on identifying sophisticated corporate fraud schemes. Agent Sarah Williams, who had led the investigation into David and Angela's crimes, explained that our case had become a model for understanding how long-term fraud operates within family-controlled businesses. The Richardson Consulting investigation revealed vulnerabilities in corporate oversight that we're seeing replicated across multiple industries, Agent Williams explained during our initial consultation meeting. Your family's documentation and response protocols provide insights that could help prevent similar schemes from succeeding elsewhere. The FBI training contract represented validation from the federal law enforcement community that our crisis management approach had been both effective and replicable. More practically, it established Hammond Holdings as a recognized expert in corporate security and fraud prevention, creating opportunities for consulting work with companies seeking to strengthen their internal controls. The 17th month marked Richardson Consulting's entry into the technology sector, with new service lines focused on helping emerging companies navigate regulatory compliance and strategic planning challenges. The expansion was facilitated by Hammond Holdings' investment portfolio, which included stakes in several successful technology startups that needed sophisticated business advisory services. Technology companies require consulting approaches that understand both traditional business principles and the unique challenges of rapid scaling, Michael Chen explained during the Technology Practice launch event. Our combination of Hammond Holdings' strategic resources and Richardson Consulting's operational expertise provides exactly the kind of comprehensive support that emerging companies need. The technology expansion demonstrated how our crisis-driven transparency had created opportunities that would have been impossible under David's fraudulent management. Technology companies conducted extensive due diligence on their service providers, and Richardson Consulting's clear ownership structure and documented capabilities provided the credibility necessary to win competitive consulting engagements. The 18th month brought news that Angela had violated the terms of her federal parole by attempting to start an unlicensed consulting business in Phoenix. Her arrest and return to federal custody illustrated how the consequences of her criminal activities continued to compound years after her initial conviction. Ms. Martinez's violation of federal parole demonstrates the ongoing impact of her criminal choices, Harrison Beck observed when we received notification of her re-imprisonment. Federal fraud convictions carry lifelong consequences that extend far beyond the initial prison sentence. Angela's continued legal troubles provided a stark contrast to Richardson Consulting's legitimate success. While she remained trapped by the consequences of her criminal choices, our business continued expanding into new markets and service areas through systematic investment and authentic relationship building. The 19th month marked Hammond Holdings' recognition as Family Business of the Year by the Chicago Business Journal, an honor that acknowledged both our business success and our effective management of family succession challenges. The award ceremony was attended by representatives from over 200 family-controlled businesses across the Midwest. Hammond Holdings exemplifies the strategic thinking and generational planning that enable family businesses to thrive across multiple decades, the award presenter notes during the ceremony. Their ability to navigate complex succession challenges while maintaining business growth demonstrates the leadership principles that define successful family enterprises. The family business recognition was particularly meaningful because it acknowledged our success in terms that transcended the criminal prosecution of David and Angela. We had earned respect as a model family business through strategic decision-making and effective governance, rather than simply through exposing fraud. The 20th month brought Richardson Consulting's expansion into healthcare consulting, with specialized teams focused on helping medical practices and healthcare systems optimize their operations and regulatory compliance. The healthcare expansion was supported by Hammond Holdings' existing relationships with medical device manufacturers and pharmaceutical companies. Healthcare organizations require consulting services that understand both business optimization and regulatory complexity, I explained during the healthcare practice announcement. Our combination of business expertise and industry relationships provides healthcare clients with comprehensive support that addresses their unique operational challenges. The healthcare expansion represented another example of how legitimate business development differed from David's fraudulent approaches. Rather than misrepresenting capabilities or stealing relationships, Richardson Consulting was building sustainable practice areas through systematic investment in expertise and authentic partnership development. The 21st month brought an invitation to join the board of directors of the Chicago Economic Development Corporation, a position that would provide input into the city's long-term business development strategies. The appointment was supported by many of the business leaders who had witnessed the anniversary dinner revelation. Rebecca Hammond's strategic leadership and crisis management expertise make her an ideal addition to the CEDC board, announced Mayor Patricia Johnson during the appointment ceremony. Her understanding of both family business dynamics and corporate governance will provide valuable perspective as we work to strengthen Chicago's business environment. The civic appointment represented recognition that extended beyond private business success into public policy and community leadership. My role in exposing corporate fraud and building legitimate business success had established credibility that qualified me for broader leadership responsibilities. The 22nd month marked Richardson Consulting's achievement of $100 million in annual revenue, a milestone that represented growth of over 800% since the ownership revelation. The revenue achievement was celebrated at a client appreciation event attended by representatives from over 50 major companies across multiple industries. Richardson Consulting's growth demonstrates what becomes possible when consulting services are backed by genuine resources and authentic expertise, Charles Winston observed during his remarks at the celebration. Their success reflects the advantages that emerge when business relationships are built on transparency rather than deception. The revenue milestone was particularly satisfying because it represented sustainable business growth rather than temporary success. Richardson Consulting's client base was expanding because of genuine value creation rather than fraudulent relationship manipulation. The 23rd month brought Richardson Consulting's recognition by the Association of Management Consulting Firms as the fastest-growing consulting practice in North America. The recognition was based on both revenue growth and client satisfaction metrics, acknowledging the quality of service delivery as well as business expansion. Richardson Consulting's achievement reflects the kind of authentic business development that defines excellence in professional services, the association president noted during the award presentation. Their growth trajectory demonstrates how legitimate consulting practices ultimately outperform approaches based on misrepresentation or relationship manipulation. The industry recognition validated our approach to business development and established Richardson Consulting as a model for other consulting firms seeking sustainable growth strategies. The award also attracted additional talented consultants who wanted to join an organization with clear ethical standards and documented business success. The 24th month marked the second anniversary of David and Angela's conviction, an occasion that prompted comprehensive analysis of how completely our business landscape had been transformed. Hammond Holdings' total assets had increased by 60%. Richardson Consulting employed over 150 professionals, and our combined operations generated revenue that exceeded $500 million annually. The transformation that began with the anniversary dinner revelation has established Hammond Holdings as one of the most influential business organizations in the Midwest, Professor Martinez observed during her follow-up case study research. The strategic response to David Richardson's fraud created opportunities for business development that continue generating benefits years later. The academic perspective was valuable because it highlighted how crisis management could become a catalyst for positive organizational change when handled with appropriate strategic planning. David's criminal activities had forced us to examine every aspect of our operations, revealing opportunities for improvement that might have remained hidden under normal circumstances. The 25th month brought Richardson Consulting's expansion into environmental consulting, with specialized teams focused on helping companies navigate climate-related regulatory requirements and sustainability initiatives. The environmental expansion was supported by Hammond Holdings' renewable energy investments and relationships with environmental technology companies. Environmental consulting represents a natural extension of our capabilities, Michael Chen explained during the environmental practice launch. Our clients increasingly require advisory services that help them address climate-related challenges while maintaining operational efficiency and profitability. The environmental expansion demonstrated how Richardson Consulting's growth was driven by authentic client needs rather than artificial market manipulation. Companies were seeking comprehensive consulting services that addressed multiple aspects of their operations, and our expanded capabilities provided integrated solutions that independent consultants could not match. The 26th month brought news that David had been transferred to a maximum security federal prison, following an incident involving attempted bribery of prison officials. His continued legal troubles illustrated how criminal behavior often reflected deeper character flaws that persisted even after conviction and imprisonment. David Richardson's prison disciplinary issues demonstrate the personality traits that enabled his original fraud scheme, Agent Williams observed when we received notification of his transfer. Individuals who commit sophisticated corporate crimes often continue displaying similar patterns of behavior, even in highly controlled environments. David's ongoing problems provided a sobering reminder of how different our current success was from the fraudulent approach he had pursued. While he remained trapped by the consequences of his criminal choices, Hammond Holdings continued expanding through legitimate business development and authentic relationship building. The 27th month marked Richardson Consulting's launch of an executive education program in partnership with Northwestern University's Business School. The program was designed to provide mid-career professionals with advanced training in strategic planning, crisis management, and family business governance. The executive education program reflects Richardson Consulting's evolution from a traditional consulting firm into a comprehensive business development resource, I explained during the program launch ceremony. Our partnership with Northwestern provides clients and professionals with access to cutting-edge business education that complements our consulting services. The educational partnership represented another example of how legitimate business development created opportunities for sustainable growth and industry leadership. Rather than competing through fraud or misrepresentation, Richardson Consulting was building market position through authentic value creation and strategic relationship development. As I prepared for the program's inaugural class, which included several executives from companies that had witnessed the anniversary dinner revelation, I reflected on how completely my role had been transformed from David's supporting wife into a recognized leader in Chicago's business and educational communities. The journey from that devastating evening to this moment of educational leadership demonstrated how strategic patience and principled responses ultimately generated better outcomes than any fraudulent shortcut could have achieved. David and Angela's crimes had seemed profitable in the short term, but they had actually prevented access to the legitimate opportunities that became available once their deception was exposed and eliminated. The executive education program would ensure that the lessons learned from our crisis experience would benefit future business leaders, creating a legacy that extended far beyond the immediate business success that had emerged from David's downfall. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.